of the time, Dan is not only a fantastic RA, but he is also a great social dancer. And in addition to being great on the dance floor, he also enjoys Aikido, captaining broomball, and in his spare time he likes to research tiger conservation efforts in India, which is great because that's what he's going to be presenting about. So his POCS research, which is funded by the class of 1963 Independent Research Fellowship, gave him the opportunity to travel to India for a second time, the first being during his study abroad, to learn about how conservation efforts have affected those who live within those specific conservation boundaries. And so I don't want to step on his toes here, but before I give it over to Dan, I just want to say that I think he's a great guy, and I'm going to miss him next year. But I know he's going to go on to do great things, and specifically next year he'll either be working with AmeriCorps or MatchCorps, helping underprivileged youth gain admission to college. And after that, he hopes to pursue a doctorate in anthropology with an emphasis on ecology and the environment. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dan.
I'm going to start off with presenting you with my research question, then I'm going to go into defining the terms before going into findings. So the research question is, how did the conservation laws and policies of the Melghat Tiger Reserve impact the local people in terms of impoverishment and disenfranchisement? So to start with, let's talk about the two main actors in this research question, which is tiger conservation and the local people who are living in the tiger reserves. The story of tiger conservation, oddly enough, starts in Wyoming. With the creation of Yellowstone National Park, which was the world's first national park. And Yellowstone was founded on the principle of separating humans and nature in order to preserve a pristine wilderness. By this definition, humans, wherever they go, taint nature, and the two can exist at the same time. And with the rise of Western hegemony in the 20th century, this notion of nature and conservation got exported to other countries, mainly through international NGOs, non-governmental organizations. The most prominent of those in India is the Worldwide Fund for Nature. So in 1972, the WWF comes along and pressures Asian countries that have viable tiger populations to do something to preserve those populations, and this was called Operation Tiger. And so what the Indian response to this was the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, which subsequently set up Project Tiger. And Project Tiger consists of multiple tiger reserves across India, started with 8 and now there's over 30, based on the same principle of Yellowstone, of separating humans and nature. There's a different conservation strategy, though, that is currently gaining ground, and that's a more people-oriented conservation strategy. So the newest chief scientist of the WWF, who was just hired, is from the University of Washington, and he proposes a people-oriented conservation strategy in relation to tigers. So what we see here is a map of Nepal, and just on the border of Nepal and India is the Tarai landscape. And on the Nepal side of the border, there are several protected areas. And what this project is seeking to do is to create corridors between those protected areas so that animals can pass between them, thus increasing the genetic diversity of species there. However, there are several populations of people living in the vicinity. And so what they've come up with is involving those people in the conservation efforts, in not only employing them in anti-poaching patrols, but also creating economic incentives such as allowing community forestry on a limited scale so that people can kind of watch over the conservation effort. This is especially important in India because, as we can see from this map, there's a strong overlap between people and tigers. So especially in the center area where we see all the black dots are tiger reserves, the shaded areas are what's called Schedule 5 areas, and we'll get to that in just a second. But in the beginning of the 20th century, it's estimated that there were 30,000 Bengal tigers, which is the subspecies found in India, 30,000. Currently, the global population of all 6 subspecies of wild tigers is between 3,500 and 4,000. And this is mostly due to human activities, which is why, one of the reasons why this protectionist model of separating humans and nature was adopted. Both land reallocation, development, and poaching all contributed to the decline of the tigers. So what we see here, this is the Melghat Tiger Reserve where I did my research, and you'll see that it's in a Schedule 5 area. Well, Schedule 5 area brings us to the second actor involved here, which are the local people. And in this case, these are scheduled tribes. Scheduled tribe is a notion, it's a layover from the colonial era, and in the British attempt to understand India, they came up with a bunch of categories to put people into, and they found that there was sort of an other category of people who don't really fit in. This happened to be the scheduled tribes. So amongst them, there's not a whole lot of similarity, but they're united by their difference to the mainstream Indian culture. Scheduled tribes, this notion exists, was preserved in the Indian Constitution, where at the end we see a very long list by state of groups that are scheduled tribes, and they have certain political reservations in the public sector. In Melghat, the scheduled tribe that we find is the Korku tribe, which comprises about 80% of the population. We can also see scheduled tribes as Adivasis. Also remind me, ask me why there's a picture of JB, because I can't get to it right now. But Adivasis literally means original inhabitants, and this brings up notions of indigeneity. I, however, am not going to speak in terms of indigeneity for a few reasons. One, when you talk about original inhabitants, that brings up some notion that you know who got to a place first. In this case, we don't. There are several groups, the Korkus, there's also lots of other tribes and castes in the area, and I don't want to create a power dynamic that doesn't already exist between those groups. I also want to avoid indigeneity because of its relation to the Hindu nationalist movement, which kind of defines itself by excluding Muslims and Christians from Indian society. They kind of want to get them out. But what's interesting is that their definition of Hinduism involves the Buddhists, involves the Sikhs, involves the Jains, and involves the scheduled tribes, which they all see as derivative of Hinduism. And so, and I'm speaking in broad brushstrokes, obviously, there's smaller nuances there, but it's really an indigenous nationalist movement. They want everybody who was in India originally to have control of India and get everybody else out. And they're responsible for thousands of deaths in India's history, and I don't want to conflate conversations here and associate what I'm talking about with these larger movements. So I'm using the term local people, which I think in our sense also helps to sort of demystify it, because we have a notion of what a tribe is and what Native people look like, and that's not really, there's not much overlap between our notion of the tribe and what I'm talking about, the people there. So what this picture is of is the main drag of the village of Shalati, which is where I did most of my research. Shalati is in central India in the Melghat Tiger Reserve, and it has a population of about 400, which, as you'll see, live in these houses here. And it's surrounded by about a square kilometer of farmland. What's important about this, though, is that Shalati is not an isolated village. And that if we zoom back out a little bit, we can see several other clearings in the forest, which are other villages, and so there is a network there. And this is going back to the larger view, the green area is the Melghat Tiger Reserve, which is organized like this. The orange area is the core area of National Park, where there are no human settlements. The pinkish-purplish area is the buffer zone, or the sanctuary, where there are 19 villages. And the yellow area around that is the multiple-use area, which has 39 villages. And the multiple-use area is a region designated for eco-development, but as we'll see, that hasn't been really happening to any significant degree. And again, Shalati is here in the multiple-use area, about 10 miles from the border of Madhya Pradesh, which is the state to the north. So aside from being known for its tigers, Melghat is also known for rampant malnutrition. In 1997, there was a media firestorm when it was revealed that over 1,000 children had died that year of complications with malnutrition. And I want to clarify right now that this is the larger area of Melghat, not just the Tiger Reserve, but Melghat is a region involving many more villages, upwards of 300, and that 1,000 number consists of that whole territory. But this media firestorm mobilized a portion of the Indian population to go and do something about it. And so there are several NGOs in the area that were established in 1997 to help curb this malnutrition. The one that I was associated with was Melghat Mitra, which is a subsidiary of Maitri Pune. Melghat Mitra means friend of Melghat. And they soon found, after getting to Melghat, though, that the issue is much more than just a health issue. It's a social issue and it's an economic issue. And from my experience with them, that's kind of, I wanted to see if the original, what got me interested in this project, seeing if there was a correlation between living in a tiger reserve and being impoverished in this sense. So what do I mean by impoverishment and disenfranchisement? We're all familiar with Marshall Solins, and I'm using his definition of poverty in that he says poverty is a social relation. So it's much more than just a number of how much money you make over a year. It's the meaning of that value. And so when he was doing his study with Bushmen in Africa, he was claiming that they're much more affluent than the rest of the outside population in that they have exactly what they need and they're content. Whereas outsiders would see Bushmen as very impoverished because they don't have a lot of material wealth. So in order to get at these notions, I conducted 13 structured interviews with a questionnaire that I developed, just interviewing your average villager, whoever would talk to me. There were also 17 unstructured interviews, more conversational, which I talked to forest officers, people who work for the forest department, doctors, teachers, that sort of thing. And there was also participant observation involved. Going to festivals, going to engagements. I also had enough research money to be able to hire an interpreter, Sunita, who was extremely helpful. She had a master's in anthropology, and she translated between Hindi and English for me, and really developed into more of a co-researcher, and I'm greatly indebted to her. So now that we've defined all those terms, let's go on to findings.